We have a wonderful plenary speaker here this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce Phil Enquist. Phil is a partner in charge of the city design practices with Skidmore, Owings Merrill. SOM is among the world's leading design, planning, architecture, and engineering firms, and its city design practice is the world's most highly awarded urban planning group. And I believe the energy efficiency community, working with this community, that master plans, green and brown field developments can do great things together in the future. Phil claims that Chicago is his home base, but if you look at his project portfolio, that's got to be a virtual presence in Chicago. So far, Phil and his team have managed to improve the quality and efficiency of city living on 5 continents. And this evening, Phil will address designing our urban future. Please help me welcome Phil Enquist.
Okay, well, how does one follow Art Rosenfeld? I'm sorry I haven't met you before. I was completely inspired by your talk. Thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me to this incredible summer session. It's really an honor to come from the design community and be invited to a community like this with so many distinguished scientists. I'm an architect and an urban planner, and so I will try to present at a very high level, but I'm interested in sharing with you my experience in terms of global migration to cities, what I think is happening around the world. And I think we're experiencing a whole new map being drawn. What's happening is a tremendous urbanization trend. In the United States, we've been really urban for many years. But as Asia continues to urbanize, Africa urbanizes, India is urbanizing, the whole world is changing. And our energy, our sustainable solutions are connected to this trend. And this very interesting evolution framework of cities across the globe. I think it's very important for us to try to understand the strengths and also the weaknesses of cities. They can be key contributors to this global transformation towards let's say a green planetary transformation, achieving at some point carbon neutrality. So I'm going to share this with you, and I think it's a time of great optimism, actually, as we are urbanizing, coming closer together. It's a time of interesting connectedness, and as we're all experiencing climate change, it's bringing us together in new and interesting ways. So I think our future is very urban. So this was on the cover of the New Yorker magazine in May of this year, and I love this because it shows a family growing food, growing energy, standing there almost off the grid, being self-reliant. And yet our cities really don't look like this today, but the aspiration is there. Our cities are looking more like this. And what's interesting is they are changing rapidly. This is London, which is experiencing phenomenal change as people are more and more attracted to living, working, going to school in cities of this caliber. Why is New York City building phenomenal cultural attractions? Why is Melbourne spending so much time and energy strengthening the walkability of their city, transforming laneways into pedestrian ways, keeping blocks small, insisting buildings have front doors on every street. Why is Copenhagen cleaning its harbor to the point where people can swim in it? Why is Toronto investing so much in public urban space? Or Singapore reinventing global entertainment? Or Chicago emphasizing urban living at the rate of about 4,000 building permits per year in the central area of Chicago? Or Hong Kong continuing to invest in public transit? Or Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, investing in clean water systems? San Francisco in their urban markets, Guangzhou building high-performance buildings, Tokyo building incredible retail districts such as Omotesando, or Sydney continuing to reinvest in their cultural ribbon and their enlivened waterfront. Why is all this happening? There is a phenomenal interest in cities that is very different than when I started my practice in the late 70s, early 80s, across the bay from Lawrence Berkeley Lab in San Francisco. Density was a bad word. Business parks were what everybody was working on. No one was investing in downtowns. I came from Los Angeles, where as a design student at USC, if you worked or were interested in downtown Los Angeles, everyone thought you were nuts. The cool thing was Venice or Santa Monica or Malibu, but certainly not downtown Los Angeles. But now we're seeing a great shift. Really, much of this will be from McKinsey Global Institute statistics, but a shift from nations to cities. This is, I think, one of our challenges. We're still growing at a phenomenal rate, about 1 billion people every 14 years. By 2050, we'll be maybe at 10 billion people, but we're also seeing urban migration at a phenomenal amount. So today, 50% of the world is urbanized. So take half of 7 billion, so 3.5 billion people are in cities, but by 2050, it's estimated we'll be 70 to 75% urban, which puts us at about 7 billion people in urban environments, twice what we have today. So we have this interesting combination of global population growth plus urban migration, putting a lot of pressure on our cities, how they function and how they remain or become livable places. There's a great shift in the global GDP led right now by Chinese cities. 30% growth. North America is next with 10% growth, and then Latin America follows out at 5%. The top 50 cities ranked by GDP have been shifting. The dark green dots, if you can see them, well, you know where they are. The east coast of China, India. The hollow dots that don't have a color, mostly in Europe and in the Midwest, were part of the top 50 cities that are now not, as the economy shifts more to the east. China is estimating 400 million people moving into cities, more than the US population. Shenzhen, since the time we started working there in 1990 with the Shenzhen Planning Bureau, we were helping them in their planning of the city in 1990 when they were about 2 million people. Today, they're over 14 million people and still growing quite rapidly. India estimates 200 million people migrating into cities. This is a phenomenal thing because it's rising people out of poverty levels. It's giving people higher income, better access to jobs. But many of the cities are not prepared. Cities are overwhelmed in terms of the process of accommodating this kind of growth. The infrastructure is lacking. The whole basis for accommodating growing populations is really lacking. North America is also very interesting. We've been studying the Great Lakes watershed for the last 5 years, which is home to about 50 million people. And by 2100, North America, if you take Mexico, US, and Canada, we're estimated at being about 650 million people. Today we're at 470 million, so it's almost a growth of 200 million people in North America. So where do they go? Do we keep building cities in the desert? Do we keep sprawling, or do we reinvest in places we've already urbanized? So just quickly, as I mentioned, the McKinsey Global Institute, they are estimating an unprecedented demand for new buildings and infrastructure of almost 475 billion square feet of new growth, which is also a great opportunity to get it right or get it better than we have in the past. The global GDP will double by 2025, adding almost 4 US equivalent economies. A tremendous amount of growth will be seen in what they call middleweight cities, which are well below 10 million people population, so more in the family of cities of about 1 million people. We'll be experiencing a tremendous amount of growth. There will be a rapid growing global middle class, which will put more demand on our natural resources. So you've got this interesting combination of climate change, urban migration, demands on our natural resources, but also creating new, very interesting collaborations between the science community and the design community, which I think is long overdue. I wanted to just quickly share with you this other trend of where major populations are. We've got these 5 big urban regions in the world that make up 66% of all economic activity, 85% of all technical innovation is really concentrated in these urban areas. And I think that's also pointing to why cities are really great places. So I'll just show you very quickly what these are. The Gangetic Plain, this stretches from Pakistan along the Yellow River all the way to Bangladesh, an area that's also 250 million people, stressed with the lack of water, and then also urbanized areas that are threatened by sea level rise. You also have the Bohai Rim, northern China, radiating all around Beijing. That is about 200 million people and growing rapidly. The Yangtze River Valley is the third one, following the Yangtze from Shanghai all the way to Chengdu, also about 200 million people. These areas are also challenged by sea level rise and challenged by a shortage of fresh water. The European core makes up about 100 million people, stretching from the industrial cities of the United Kingdom all the way to northern Italy. And then the last one that was mentioned in this Mark magazine article was the Great Lakes region, which is a little liberal in the boundaries, but stretching from Minneapolis to Cincinnati to Quebec. 60 million people here, and these are very interesting centers in the world. There are others, of course, the West Coast, East Coast of the United States, others, but these mega regions leading technical innovation I thought was very interesting and speaks to the value of cities. So some of the challenges, you know what they are. I'll go through these quickly. Many estimates on cities being so great at emitting carbon, which also means we have a focused area to look at and try to solve to get cities to emit far less carbon. That transmits to not great air quality. Urban water is in phenomenal demand, and it's expected to be, the demand will be far greater than supply. Just some fun statistics. American cities, 90% of Americans commute by car. Copenhagen, it's a terrible city to use because they are so good at things. Copenhagen, 36% commute by bicycles. I mean, it's so interesting that the bicycle is considered a very serious form of commuting. So staying with Copenhagen for a minute, Chicago puts about 90% of its waste in landfill. Copenhagen prides itself at saying they put about 4% of their waste in landfill, and they recycle and they use waste to energy strategies throughout the city. We have in many cities poor transportation infrastructure. This one scares me, but now listening to Art, I'm not scared anymore. We have an aging world. Maybe we don't have to worry about catching water balloons, but we do have an aging world, and the average age is increasing. Sea level rise, of course. 600 million people at immediate risk to sea level rise. Poverty is still a phenomenal challenge. Loss of natural habitats. This farming practices, this is the end result of some farming practices. This is what was going on in Toledo just a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you read that in the paper, where a city on a Great Lake could not access their water because of the nutrients from the agricultural lands were creating algae blooms. So this was what they had. This was what was in the Wall Street Journal. And this is what Lake Erie looks like after one storm event. And so you see in the light color the runoff impacts to a Great Lake. Sustainable urban models. I come from a design firm. We're famous for high-rise buildings. We designed and engineered Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. It's a phenomenal engineering feat. But is it really a sustainable model? Is this the way cities should be going? Are there simpler ways to achieve density? So moving forward, we always like to go back to Bucky Fuller because he had such an amazing ability to think across disciplines, and he said, how big can we think? We have research going on in our firm now with wood building materials that have so much lower embodied carbon or embodied energy. Can we re-engineer wood and wood systems to build higher density buildings? Can we design windows on curtain walls to be completely shaded? Can we use plant materials to cool the air? Can we integrate wind technology in our buildings to capture wind renewable energy? We're seeing all through China, if you've been traveling to China at all since 2008, when they started operating their high-speed rail system, a complete transformation in the country with this remarkable way to move. And the shift of transportation to electricity as opposed to fossil fuels. And as I mentioned earlier, the investment cities are making in making their cities more friendly, more livable, more family-oriented. We're seeing a shift in American city priorities away from zoning single land use zones. So this horrible photo of shopping malls, business parks, we're really seeing a great trend across the country to move away from this kind of thinking. We're seeing much more reinvestment in existing cities where we've already built the schools, the roadway, the transit infrastructure to increase density. It's a great shift from where we were 20 years ago. Charting a new course in how we fund transportation, thinking that we can sustain this kind of highway infrastructure forever is kind of ridiculous. We've got to find ways for, especially American cities, to invest more heavily in transit. Find ways to direct funds to cities so that cities can afford this transportation infrastructure. Rethink systems like how we access clean water. Cities can be designed to grow their own fresh water, to capture rainwater, filter it, create more permeable ground planes. This is a diagram that Urban Lab did in Chicago, talking about how Chicago, which right now takes 2 billion gallons of fresh water every day from Lake Michigan, uses that and then flushes it down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico to contribute to the dead zone there. I mean, how smart is that? Why can't we take Great Lakes water, use it, and then filter it and return it back to the aquifer? Obviously, choices in our fuel, and level with the American people about the true cost of a fossil fuel-based economy. What is it really costing us to live this way? And then how we see cities supporting innovation. For example, New York, great strides in innovation to make that city more accessible, more livable. This is a diagram of employment growth projected in Greater London by 2020, where 15% of London jobs will be in healthcare and education, and another 15%, 14% will be in science, technical professions. So it shows you where the economy is headed in a very positive way. So our design work, our urban planning work, is mostly done with public sector planners. Our clients are mostly governments. And we see a real effort in working towards a carbon neutral future and a more livable yet urban future. So I just have 6 principles here. And the first one is really moving forward how we define urban metrics. So we're measuring apples to apples, oranges to oranges. And I wanted to share with you the Green City Index that was funded by Siemens, which was one way of doing this under 8 categories from CO2 emissions to energy, buildings, transport, waste, water, air quality, and governance. They started measuring cities over a 5-year period. So again, this is Copenhagen and how it measures against all 8 criteria, or Zurich, or Stockholm, all the golden cities that are doing pretty good. And then you compare it to, in the same metrics, here's Detroit. The darker, or the middle blue is sort of the city average across the cities they looked at. Far below average. Cleveland, a little better, but still not great. Chicago, better. Montreal, Toronto. I thought I'd throw in some Canadian cities because we're all in this together. Minneapolis, doing very well in some areas. So I thought this was a fantastic way to start to measure at the scale of a city. So you can target energy or target water or target waste, and you can compare metrics from one city to the next. The second is just that transportation is such a critical component to any planning framework for urban growth. So here are some examples. This is Hong Kong comparing the residential population, employment population along transit lines. So you can see this entire compact city is very dependent on public transportation. This is Copenhagen also, which way back in 1946 or 47, they laid out the finger plan for the city and they directed growth along those rail lines and have stuck to it. This just shows, it's an interesting diagram that shows the relationship between transportation, energy, and density. And I'll take you through each grouping quickly. So North American cities tend to be at the high end of this, which means a high level of energy spent in transportation from Houston to Toronto. Australian cities are a little bit better. European cities, more compact and a stronger infrastructure of transit, performing better. And then Asian cities, Tokyo, Singapore, and Hong Kong, performing far better in terms of the amount of energy spent on transportation. So you put all these together, it's quite dramatic how far we have to go in North America. And embracing things like high-speed rail. If we could, in the 1950s, figure out a way to fund an interstate highway system, why do we shy away from thinking about how to develop a national transportation policy and fund new levels of transportation? So China is building infrastructure that takes your breath away. This is the South High-Speed Rail Station in Beijing. For the last 8 years, we've been working with the Beijing, Tianjin governments on planning for additional growth in Beijing. These trains run every 20 minutes. They have 500 seats on a train, and they are usually full. And so they've taken these people off the highway. And this is a culture that did not have rail in their culture. Very few people moved by rail. So working with these governments, we've been looking at the expansion of the Beijing Central Business District, which includes greening the water systems through the city, adding more localized transit, getting the CBD for the first time connected directly to the airport and the high-speed train stations, looking at how to reduce energy, carbon, conserving water, recycling waste in this district. A next stop on this line is Bohai, which is an industrial area that the city is now defining as a high-density community. And the last one on the line is at the Bohai Port of Beijing. And they don't think in small terms. I mean, they talk about, they hire us to design a new city, and they mean it. I mean, they mean very high density. The end of this high-speed rail line, the station is right in the middle of that cluster of buildings. Now, we overlaid the high-speed rail in China on the United States, and you can see the scale is actually quite similar to the Midwest and the East Coast. From Beijing down to Hong Kong, it's similar to Toronto, Montreal, down to New Orleans or Miami. If we just connected Milwaukee to Toronto, for example, one line from Milwaukee to Toronto, that would be about a 3.5 hour to maybe 4 hour train ride if we were moving at the same speed, 230 miles an hour, and it would connect 28 million people. Why aren't we thinking about this kind of infrastructure here? It would be electric, which means we could use renewable energy sources, and it would free up our airports for more long-haul flights than all the short-haul flights. Chicago has been anticipating, and we've been working with them on how they would incorporate high-speed rail in their current metro stations that they have today. Denver also investing in their regional rail system and transforming downtown, a very positive rail investment for this city. Bicycles, we're seeing them now in a lot more American cities, bicycles you can rent that are free for the first 30 minutes. In Paris, you can see electric vehicles for rent. And the emphasis most American cities are placing now on making urban neighborhoods very walkable. You certainly can save a tremendous amount of money or energy if you walk. London has a zero-emission electric cab, and many cities are investing in bus rapid transit because it's about 10 to 15% of the cost of a light rail system. The third point is just that urban form really does matter. Keeping cities compact is very critical. This is Toronto that has the Ontario Greenbelt that wraps the city. It has done this to protect farmland and natural habitat areas, but also to keep the city from continuing to sprawl. London invests in areas that aren't that easy to reinvest in. Brownfield sites like Canary Wharf in the 1980s now looks like this today. Broadgate building the next generation office buildings over active rail lines. Or this is Nine Elms, which is proposed high density in London over major transit lines. Detroit, we've done a lot of work with the city of Detroit until we were fired. But Detroit is an interesting case study of being too big. It's a huge land area. You can put San Francisco, Boston, and all of Manhattan in there. It averages sort of 2 to 4 units per acre over all of Detroit. So you've got 140 square miles, 700,000 people. If you took Boston, Manhattan, San Francisco, you'd have 3 million people and less area. It's a shrinking city. It peaked at almost 2 million people in the 1950s, and it's down to 700,000 today. And it looks like this. It has a scattered vacancy pattern. It's not like one area is completely vacant. It's like each block has maybe a third, 2/3 vacancy. So how do you address this? How do you infill in all this land, or do you collect certain neighborhoods and bring people together? We proposed a very simple strategy of looking at areas of strength that had a mix of jobs, residential, education, commercial, identifying these as areas of strength and trying to stick to those, reinvesting in those. so that these became very strong centers. Then we linked those together in every way possible using the existing boulevard system, proposed transit systems, and then the vacant land start to emerge as larger parkland that could free us up from all the piped below ground rivers and streams that they have and get into a more biofiltrated stormwater park system. So it meant relocating people into denser areas. It did mean supporting some neighborhoods over others. It meant that downtown mattered, which was maybe obvious, but in a region that was healthy, in a city that was not healthy, many people thought downtown didn't matter. Making it a safer city and a greener city. The relocation was such an issue that we actually did get fired. I wasn't joking, we got fired. But it seemed like the logical thing to do. You can't expect a city to resolve that great an area of vacancy and continue to live at such a low density. The fourth that we're seeing so much improvement on is just repairing our ecosystems, getting more aware of them and repairing them. This is a piece of the Chicago River that's proposed to be turned back into an active wetland, about a mile-long wetland park in the middle of downtown. The Los Angeles River is going through some very interesting greening soft bottom strategies today to remove that concrete bottom and start to let the water percolate down into aquifers, improve the edges of this river. It's kind of logical to go from a fenced-off thing to something people can access. And we're starting to see interesting design alternatives now for the Los Angeles River. It's just a phenomenal idea, and pieces of it actually look like this today. And it will become, I think, a 32-mile park for the city of Los Angeles. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia is taking urban degraded waters and filtering it through this interesting rock matrix biofiltration strategy, cleaning their water and bringing it back into the Wadi Hanifa. It's becoming the center of Riyadh, where it was the sort of polluted water corridor. It's now a public park system. Bahrain has been looking at all of its marine spatial land in its country and doing a spatial plan for this water to protect the coral reefs and keep development off these coral reefs, which means re-emphasizing existing cities and organic growth of existing cities and densification. So this is an image of Manama, Bahrain, that will densify as a way to keep development from moving offshore onto islands built on coral reefs. And I mentioned earlier this work on the Great Lakes. We've been working for 5 years on the full Great Lakes watershed, both sides of the border, looking at common principles that every city within this watershed can share so that they use cleaner energy sources, they grow food more responsibly. Oh, which leads us to this, growing food more responsibly. Rick Bayless, a chef in Chicago, said, "Cities of the future will be farms we happen to live in." Growing food closer reduces the carbon footprint. The average tomato, I think, is moving 1,500 miles between field and dinner plate. You're seeing a lot of urban agriculture occurring, which is also tied to education, access to poor communities, education around nutrition, and also discussions about protecting our unique sources of food like wild rice fields in the Midwest. In cities, we're seeing a lot in terms of energy, water, and waste innovation, moving beyond coal, moving more and more to renewable energy, reducing the carbon footprint, especially in the Midwest around the Great Lakes. This was a quote, I just threw this in here because I thought I have a lot of scientists in the audience, and this came from Lars Reimann of Ramboll in Copenhagen, who said, "The way to solve the American city problem is to reduce carbon content and energy production by half, reduce demand at the user's end by half, improve efficiencies of the systems by twice, and the result would be 85% carbon emission reductions in all American cities." Anyway, we can talk about that later. We've been developing brownfield sites. This is the Southwark Steel Plant, 600-acre brownfield site in Chicago on Lake Michigan. We have the ability to design a whole new infrastructure, district energy strategies, water filtration strategies. We can build at a density that can deliver district heating and cooling. We can return 100% of the stormwater filtered through the park systems back to Lake Michigan. It will be the biggest part of Chicago that goes back to Lake Michigan. We can recycle waste. We can link it to the community in all sorts of ways, design the streets to be more comfortable for bicyclists and walking, size the size of the urban block to be comfortable for walking, and develop an ICT platform that also aids in all of these aspirations. And then last, I just want to close with changing our priorities, and Jonas Salk wrote this great little book called World Population and Human Values. And this was around 1980, where he said that when we reach about 7 billion people, we'll experience a new reality. And that reality is where we realize that instead of endless resources, we have a limit to how much we can use from the earth. That instead of the old way of doing things of competition, independence, power, winning, we now will be working more in collaborative ways, interdependence, and building consensus. And he said the new global generation will emerge directing a more sustainable future, and I think all of you in this room are a great indication of that. With more accountable governments, widened access to education, the role of women definitely improving across the globe, and a slowing global population. So I just think, in closing, that we're moving towards a more and more non-siloed view, interesting collaborations, healthier ecosystems, and higher quality urban life. So it is, I think, a very optimistic time. There's a lot of work to do, but there's reason to be optimistic. So thank you very much. I know I probably went over, but thank you for sticking it out with me. I think I'm supposed to ask if there are any questions. Oh, okay.
That was a great talk, thank you. I'm not so sure that I'm convinced that your 70% of 9 billion people in cities is really realistic. We are in a neck and neck race with global warming. My personal guess is that the world will not support 9 billion people at the standards that you show in your pretty pictures. And I don't think that we want those 7 billion people in the typical city, which is 2/3 unacceptable slums. But in this race with global warming, the one thing that we are going to run into trouble is air transportation. Air travel has gotten so nice and fast that you can fly across the country in 4 hours, and you don't think very much about the fuel use. But I keep pointing out that air travel now consumes 15 to 20%, or produces 15 to 20% of our carbon footprint. And we don't think a damn thing about commuting to New York for one Thanksgiving dinner. And the picture that I keep telling the younger generation is that is not sustainable. We can do that sort of thing with a train with a great deal less gasoline, jet fuel. And the specific picture I tell my grandchildren is it's all very well to fly from San Francisco to New York for a family reunion on Thanksgiving Day, but flying from San Francisco to New York, you get about the same fuel economy per seat mile as driving a Prius from San Francisco to New York. And so every time your 777 lands and disgorges 300 people or 250 people, that's the same as 250 cars just having been driven across the country for that one flight. And we ought to do it by rail. So bless you for proposing some money into high-speed rail. Thank you.
I think one of the other critical missing links in urban planning is that land use planning traditionally has never coincided with transportation planning. They're usually two separate departments. They're separately funded. And the two have to be combined. You have to take transportation planning and land use planning and put them on top of each other. And we used to do that when people didn't own cars. We used to do that in American cities when we had a rail infrastructure. Once we became dependent on the automobile, it somehow allowed land use planning to be free of transportation planning. And I think we have to turn that full circle so that we're not free to zone open lands for any kind of development. We have to tie it back to transportation or public transportation alternatives. I think those go hand in hand.
In recent years, there's been a real flurry of construction of multifamily housing, a lot more people moving back to cities or the inner suburbs as opposed to the outer suburbs. You have young people who are often getting driver's license later, vehicle ownership is going down, public transportation use is going up. Do you see from your work that these trends may continue, or do we have a temporary aberration and, well, we may go to our previous patterns?
That's a really good question. There's a group called CEOs for Cities that's done a lot of research on this. They did a deep dive in Chicago and found that within a 3-mile radius, you had a tremendous number of 24 to 35-year-olds living there without cars, commuting into jobs in downtown, maybe more than any other city in the United States, because Chicago still has relatively affordable housing. There are challenges to this urban dream. One of them is access to good education in urban environments. You still will see families start to exit the central city cores when they have children because of access to better schools. That's still an issue. We've got to get better education in the hearts of cities. And just the cost of living, the cost of housing in downtowns. If you look at how much it costs to live within an easy commute of a job in downtown San Francisco, it will force people to move further out and accept a longer commute. So I think affordability, access to education are probably the two biggest challenges. It's not the traditional challenges were safety, crime, pollution of urban environments. Those aren't really players anymore. It's more the affordability issues. Yes.
My name is Jim McMahon. I'm a lead author on the upcoming IPCC assessment report, the chapter on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning. I thank you for your positive and constructive presentation of solutions for the future. My question, I think, follows on one of your pictures about using wood in buildings. The infrastructure carbon footprint is very large for the concrete and steel and so forth for building all of these new cities. And I wonder if you would comment on solutions to that aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The embodied energy of concrete and steel is high. There's a lot of research right now on wood technologies, laminated wood technologies, to be able to build higher density and still meet fire ratings. We have a fair amount of funding right now investigating this, as other groups. We're planning to build I'm not even going to say how many floors because I don't really know, but a taller building out of this wood technology to be able to test it against fire codes. But I think the idea of wood used in more innovative ways does make sense, especially in laminated technologies, so you can grow soft woods and laminate them. I think also just watching the whole bamboo industry transform things like wood flooring seems to make a lot of sense, since it's a renewable grass and you're not killing it when you harvest it. I think we have a long way to go here, but I think clearly people are interested in alternatives to steel and concrete.
Hi. My name is Beth Conlon. I'm here with the EPA, but I'd actually like to speak as a private citizen of Washington, D.C., which is a place where we've seen the first increases in population in almost 50 years. We have light rail, new light rail, we have bike share, and we have lots of new high-end condos. We also have reportedly a large number of gas leaks, water pipes that are over 100 years old, many of them soldered with lead, combined sewer outflows, and a sinkhole opening up in the middle of 14th Street. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas on how revitalizing cities can conquer these less glamorous issues of getting this invisible infrastructure up to an acceptable level.
Yeah, that's a great question too. We were part of a conversation not long ago in St. Louis about how the U.S. funds the maintenance of infrastructure. And so much of that is tied to the gas tax, which seems so strange to me, because if that's your only funder, your primary funding mechanism for maintaining infrastructure, then isn't that counterproductive to finding fuel-efficient vehicles? So I think we have to find completely new ways to fund urban infrastructure. It's expensive, and it's expensive to maintain and rebuild. And cities on their own have a real hard time doing this. Yet, how is it possible that generations ago, people were inventing the Vascule Bridge in Chicago, which could open and close whenever a ship went by, building these bridges every 300 feet because every street on the urban grid crossed the river. And then some of these bridges have rail cars on top of them. So you've got boats below, cars at surface level, and then you've got a rail line on the top of the bridge, and it opens and closes. So they were designing, innovating infrastructure 100 years ago. I just don't quite understand how we've kind of lost our mojo. Why, where is the funding for that kind of innovation in urban infrastructure? We can't just keep solving it by building more highways, more freeway connections, and spreading further and further out. We've got to, at some point, which I think we're at this moment, where we're going to start reinvesting in the cores and not building on greenfield sites. When we were working in Detroit, they had this massive water loop system. They wanted to figure out a way to cut utilities to a part of the city. They didn't want to keep maintaining this water system. And there was literally no physical way to cut this without reinventing the whole water system, water distribution system. We had an economist with us in Detroit that looked at density of various cities, and he came up with a conclusion I had never heard before, where he felt that based on the real estate taxes of Detroit, they had to build at a minimum density of 14 units per acre to get the kind of tax return they needed to maintain the urban infrastructure. And Detroit was about 2 to 4 units per acre. So to build at 14 units per acre, which is not that dense, if you look at North Beach, for example, in San Francisco, is probably over 100 units per acre. Detroit at 2 to 4 units per acre, there's a lot of room to densify. But that was an interesting metric, that if a city is interested in being self-sustainable and generating enough funds in real estate tax to maintain their infrastructure, they have to build at a density of 14 units per acre. I thought it was an interesting benchmark and reason to be building at this greater density. Washington, D.C. is a wonderful example of a city turning around, and it was about 10 years ago when the Brookings Institution announced that they wanted to increase the city population by 100,000 people. And it was kind of a phenomenal moment. I don't think they even knew what that meant, but it was a nice number, and it's a city that's not that big and very well served by transit infrastructure. And 100,000 more people there would make a better city. Chicago could double its population. It would be a better city. It has the infrastructure to support a population twice its size. I think that's one way to fund these infrastructure problems.
I think I have a solution for you. We're getting older and we want more dense cities. And you will get your 14 units because we can't deal with 5,000 square feet per person.
Yeah, somewhere I was reading that Aspen, this was a while back, though, Aspen passed a law to limit the size of their houses so that they weren't going to get any more of these gigantic mansions anymore, so they limited the size to 14,000 square feet per house. So, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.